So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the actual tissues involved with the endocrine system or the neuroendocrine system, which remembers that it's almost impossible to separate the nervous system from the endocrine system in terms of its overall function, which is why we have to talk about it in terms of a combined system. When we talk about the tissues of the system, the books usually talk about it based strictly off of the glandular tissues, which include the hypothalamus and the pituitary, the pineal, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal, the pancreas, the ovary, and the testes, ovaries in females and testes in males. But the thing we have to remember is that any tissue can be a endocrine tissue, which means that we have a whole host of other tissues that come into play, which include immune cells, cardiovascular tissues, lung tissues, gastrointestinal tissues, adipose tissue, the kidney and renal tissues, as well as all of the bones and muscles of the body. All tissues can be seen as being endocrine tissues because an endocrine is simply nothing more than a chemical that is used to adapt tissues in order to maintain homeostasis. The first of the tissues that we're going to look at are what are referred to as the hypophyseal tissues. The hypophyseus is the combination of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. It's the junction point between the two systems involved here in terms of homeostatic regulation. For the longest time, we used to reference the pituitary part of this as the quote-unquote master gland. The problem is that there are so many regulators within the system that there is no true master gland that is regulating all of the system in terms of maintaining normal cyclic processes as well as maintaining homeostasis. So if we look at the hypophyseal region, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, we'll get into the pituitary in a couple seconds here, but the hypothalamus gets broken up into its various nuclei. Each nuclei is going to be responsible for a distinct regulatory function, in which the anterior hypothalamic nuclei is going to be responsible for thermoregulation as well as maintaining whole body energetics. The preoptic is going to be involved with thermal regulation, thirst regulation, reproductive regulation, whole body energetics. The dorsal medial and ventral medial are responsible for the orexic and anorexic regulations. That is the regulation in terms of whether we're going to eat or not. And that is also going to dictate what happens in terms of whole body energy balance in long-term care as it relates to regulation of the thyroid. We also have changes that come about from stimulation in the posterior nucleus, which includes thermal regulation and whole body energetics. A little bit different regulation than what we see from the anterior hypothalamus. The posterior is more about being too cold and regulating in that terms of thermal regulation, whereas the anterior is more about regulating when it's too hot. The suprachiasmatic is going to be involved with our circadian rhythm, our sleep-wake cycles, and the regulation of the pineal gland. The arcuate is going to be involved with whole body energetics, reproductive regulation, and a whole host of other functions. The mammillary body is going to be involved with predominantly the cognitive response to hypothalamic dysregulation. In terms of hormones that we see coming from the hypothalamus, we have orexins, which are going to be a class of hormones that are responsible for regulating feeding processes by changing dopamine and serotonin levels. We have melanin concentrating hormones, which is going to be involved with melanocyte stimulating hormone. We have neuropeptide Y, which is a regulatory neuropeptide. We have corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, which is involved with regulation of ACTH coming from the pituitary. We have gonadotropin releasing factors, or gonadotropin releasing hormones, which are involved with regulation of FSH and LH production from the pituitary. We have prolactin releasing and prolactin release inhibiting factors, which are involved with the regulation of prolactin production and release from the pituitary. We have growth hormone releasing hormone, as well as somatostatin, which is also known as growth hormone releasing inhibitory factor. Those are going to be involved with regulation of growth hormone production and growth hormone release from the growth hormone producing cells within the pituitary. And then we have thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, which is involved with the production of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to come in terms of release from the pituitary. Now, when we look at the schematic of the pituitary is a bulbous stalk of secretory tissue, both a combination of glandular secretory tissue in the anterior part and neural secretory tissue in the posterior part. The posterior part is predominantly neural axons with axonal terminals at the very end surrounded by capillary beds. The substances that get released from the posterior pituitary, if it was within the nervous system, we would deem them to be neurotransmitters. But since they're being released into circulation, we call them neuropeptides or neuroproteins, and they function as hormones. In the anterior side, we have more of the glandular tissue that we looked at when we looked at epithelial tissue, which are going to be stimulated by neural projections coming from distinct areas within the hypothalamus, those nuclei that we just looked at, to go ahead and release their various chemicals. The pituitary itself is going to sit within the cellular trachea of the sphenoid bone. In between the pituitary and the bony part of the cellular trachea, we have an area known as the paraventricular space. The paraventricular space has cells that release enzymes into it, which can cause what's referred to as post-translational modification of the hormones that can go ahead and activate hormones that are inactive up until that point. We can further divide the pituitary based off of general anatomical regions in which we have what's referred to as the hypophyseal stalk, which is the region coming away from the hypothalamus itself, in which we have two areas. We have the pars tuberalis to the anterior side, and we have the infundibulum to the posterior side. Coming away from the infundibulum, we get the pars nervosa. The pars nervosa is the terminus of axonal projections that started within the hypothalamus that head to the posterior side. In the anterior side, we have neurons that are going to be heading out into pars distalis, pars intermedius, as well as pars tubularis. In those areas, we have 5 distinct classifications of cells, which will each be involved with the production of the various hormones we're going to look at here in a second. These include the thyrotopic cells, the lactotropic cells, the corticotropic cells, the somatotropic cells, and the gonadotropic cells. The thyrotropic cells are going to be responsible for production of thyroid stimulating hormones. The lactotropic cells are going to be responsible for producing hormones such as prolactin. The corticotropic cells are going to be responsible for producing adrenocorticotropic hormones. The somatotropic cells are going to be responsible for producing hormones within the growth hormone family. And the gonadotropic cells are going to be responsible for producing hormones that are going to stimulate the gonads, such as FSH and LH. So let's take a look at these various hormones that are going to come away from the pituitary from those distinct cellular clusters. The tropic hormones are those that will stimulate other glands or other glandular tissue. This is where we used to consider the pituitary as the quote-unquote master gland of everything. These include thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, Then the gonadotropins, such as follicular or follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. And then we have things like melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, coming from the tropic hormones, but not necessarily classified within the tropic hormones, are the pro-opiomelanocortin hormones, or POMC hormones. These include precursors of ACTH, MSH, as well as stimulation of endorphins, and precursors that will allow for stimulation of pineal secretions. The other type of cells that we'll see within the anterior side are going to be cells that are going to be trophic in terms of their productions. These include things that are going to cause the cells to grow. These are the growing hormones, such as growth hormone, somatostatin, prolactin. Now, somatostatin and any hormone that you see that has statin in it is going to be a hormone that actually stops the growth, such as the myostatin that we saw with muscles. Growth hormone itself, as we'll look at here in a little bit, is a cluster of hormones. They're a family of hormones where we will attribute a whole bunch of functions to growth hormone, and all the functions that we attribute to growth hormone is because there's different types of growth hormones found throughout. We'll get more into this when we look at the physiology of the hormones when we get into the physiology class itself. Coming from the posterior side, we have basically 3 hormones that are going to go into circulation, and then one that is an intrapituitary hormone. The ones that are going to go into circulation are things like antidiuretic, ADH, also known as vasopressin, oxytocin, dopamine, and then prolactin releasing factor. Now, dopamine can go out into circulation, but it's also going to act as an interpituitary hormone, leading to changes of anterior and posterior signaling. Oxytocin is a very interesting hormone that's involved with cortical structural rearrangement, which we'll talk about when we get into reproductive function.